The two books are, Footprints is about intellectual property. It seeks to demystify the whole concept of what is intellectual property. So it deals with the issue in terms of what is a patent, what is copyright, what is trademarks, what is geographic indications, in a manner to allow any person to be able to understand, even a high school kid, and hopefully a primary school kid, to understand what the differences are. And it then goes into deeper detail as to how South Africa has developed a policy around publicly funded research and IP. And then it deals quite importantly with really the role of intellectual property in economic development in everyday lives, and also the scramble for vaccines. So it is different from nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts is about innovation, it's about entrepreneurship, but quite importantly is the fact that intellectual property is an essential part of innovation. Without the incentives that intellectual property provides, many innovations would not have seen the light of day.
On that note,
so yes, you can buy them, separately because they deal with interlinked, matters, but also, they also deal with separate issues.
Right. So let's talk about, some of the African countries, especially when you compare, what our international counterparts have done. Where is the challenge, especially when it comes to the adoption of IP concepts? Why are we not understanding them, especially when you're looking at it from an African point of view?
Yeah. So, which is why I think Footprints is important, because it seeks to demystify intellectual property. There's a lot of, mystery. Once you start talking about intellectual property, people see it as a barrier. And a lot of it goes back to education and the fact that in most African countries, intellectual property is seen as a preserve of lawyers. Yet intellectual property is about creativity. Artists, they deal with intellectual property because there's copyright in their works. Intellectual property is everywhere. And so the first challenge that we see in the continent is one of capacity in respect of people that are trained to understand what it is, to teach it, but also to understand how it is embedded in trade protocols, trade agreements, and also how it impacts access of goods and be able to negotiate for licenses and also technology transfer, which is quite critical. So it is improving in the continent, but there's still, those challenges of capacity, of awareness.
Right, which is a nice segue into my next question as it relates to China. What has China done right that we can learn from, especially in the way that they use intellectual property and understand it?
So many countries are governed by the World Trade Organization, and there's an agreement under the World Trade Organization, WTO, called the TRIPS Agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property. That particular agreement has got a number of concessions that are called flexibilities and exceptions. And what China did exceptionally well was use those flexibilities and exceptions to their benefit. But also they understood the fact that intellectual property is a territorial species. So if something is patented in Japan, but not in China, what they managed to understand is the fact that they can use it in China without violating the intellectual property laws. So that's the one part. The second part, which they've done extremely well, is to start to teach the concepts of intellectual property from primary school, high school, and university. So when people get out of the education system, they have a fair understanding of what intellectual property is all about. And accompanied with that is obviously the education in science, engineering, and technology, and making sure that people utilize intellectual property.
And you talk a little bit about that when you mention the deliberate mechanisms that are required to improve awareness. Is education one of those things? And are we at risk at starting that education a little bit too late, at university level already?
Yes, I mean, education is very critical because it really helps raise awareness. And so we need to start it, and I think it doesn't need to be complicated. It's basically talking to children and showing them everyday articles of manufacture, even a bottle of water, and saying, well, you see this name here called Valpa, that's a trademark. You see the design of, the cap. There's some design registrations. There's also a patent here. You see this tagline, just do it. That is a trademark. But the way certain things are arranged, that is copyright. So we can teach basic intellectual property at schools, and we should be doing much more of that. And I think even on television and radio, we should be able to have small segments where we teach our society about intellectual property because it does affect them.
Right. You have a chapter where you look at the reflections from the international experts and some of the advisors on South Africa's IP journey. What were the key takeaways from you when you got solicited some of those responses?
So, I mean, I was quite fortunate to collaborate with a number of people from across the world, India, the US, and other parts of the continent. And I think the key takeaway is that, first of all, context is important. It is very important to understand the context before one copies a system. So let me bring it to perhaps a challenge that we're sitting with around access to medicines. Yes, we can have an IP waiver, but the IP waiver is not really the solution. What we need to do is to build the manufacturing capacity, the research capacity to be able to make pharmaceuticals. Once we're able to do that, then intellectual property becomes, quite relevant. So whatever a country does in respect of intellectual property, context is important. So Zambia cannot just blatantly copy what is perhaps in footprints in the middle part of footprints, second part. It has to then look at their own economy and see where they're located, see how they can use some of these flexibilities and exceptions in the TRIPS agreement.